Hey everybody, it's Chris Kresser. Welcome to another episode of Revolution Health Radio. This week we have a question from Mikaela, so let's give it a listen. Hey everyone, if you're like most people I know, you don't have the time or the desire or training for that matter to sift through the hundreds of medical studies that are published each month. But whether you're struggling with a chronic health problem or just want to maintain your health and live as long as possible, it's important to stay informed about the latest research and how it might affect your well-being. And let's face it, it's easy to get overwhelmed by all the conflicting stories in the media. You need a source of unbiased information that you can rely on, one that's easy to understand without too much jargon and full of practical tips that you can put into action. That's where my website, chriskresser.com, comes in. You'll find in-depth, evidence-based articles on a wide range of health and nutrition topics each week. You'll also find over 10 free ebooks on subjects like effortless weight loss, healing your gut, thyroid disorders, and natural skincare, as well as online classes and programs on optimizing nutrition for fertility and pregnancy and lowering your cholesterol without drugs. What you won't find is any third-party advertising, corporate influence, or hype-driven, headline-grabbing stories with a lot of drama but no substance. You just get the real inside scoop on the health issues that matter to you most. So head over to chriskresser.com and check it out. And when you sign up for my email newsletter, you'll get instant access to my award-winning 63-page ebook, 9 Steps to Perfect Health. It's like an instruction manual for preventing and reversing disease and living a long and healthy life. Okay, now back to the show.
Hi, Chris. This is Mikaela. I have a question for you about the autoimmune protocol. Well, and actually really any elimination diet. I have been following the autoimmune protocol for Crohn's disease to control my symptoms since 2012, and I have had success, but I'm not 100% better. And I've had very limited success in reintroducing foods. So my question is, when you're following an elimination diet, if you are unable to reintroduce foods, does that mean that you're not healing, or do you think that some foods are just off the table for good? I'd love to be able to sit down and have some salsa or maybe scrambled eggs, and I'm wondering if that's just something I'm going to have to live without. Thanks for an awesome podcast, and looking forward to hearing your response.
Thanks so much for sending in your question, Mikaela. It's a great one. We receive some kind of variant of this question pretty regularly. And in some ways, it's the $1,000,000 question because there's so many people out there who are doing elimination diets like autoimmune paleo or low FODMAP or even just a 30-day paleo reset or a whole 30. And they are wondering the same thing. Will I have to be on this diet forever? Or will some healing take place that allows me to recover my function and be able to eat some of these foods that I've taken out of my diet? Now, of course, if you're removing things like Twinkies and cheese doodles and super big gulps, unfortunately, you're never going to, at least as far as we know, acquire any magical properties that will enable you to better tolerate those foods because they're just nutrient poor and calorie dense, and we have really no business eating them in the first place. But certainly there are other foods that are healthy otherwise when they're well tolerated that are removed from things like the autoimmune paleo protocol. So nightshades and eggs and nuts and even full fat or fermented dairy, I would argue, that are perfectly healthy. A lot of research supports their benefits, but may not work for some people because of certain conditions. That I'm generally a believer that our diet should be as broad and diverse within that paleo template or, paleo plus kind of template, that it might include some full fat and fermented dairy and even properly prepared legumes and some grains or pseudo grains if they're tolerated in moderation. Because the broader and more diverse we can make our diets, the greater the nutrient density and the wider variety of nutrients that we'll get. So I'm always by default an advocate for eating the broadest diet that we can tolerate, but there are obviously conditions in which we may have to restrict our diet, in some cases pretty significantly, and at least to begin with, while we're in the healing process. So as is often the case with these types of questions, the answer is it depends. I don't think there really is a single answer to Mikaela's question, but I can share my experience working with thousands of patients at this point. And what I would say is that diet is an absolutely crucial factor and sometimes the most significant factor in the healing process, but it's certainly not a panacea. Sometimes dietary changes will be enough on their own to get somebody back to where they want to be, but often additional steps are necessary above and beyond diet. So since Michaela is talking about Crohn's disease, that's an inflammatory bowel disease, which is autoimmune in nature, let's discuss an overall functional approach to autoimmunity as it relates to Michaela's question. So for me, at least, this consists roughly of 2 steps. Step 1 would be removing triggers that provoke or exacerbate a dysregulated immune response. And then step 2 would be taking specific actions to regulate the immune system if removing the triggers wasn't sufficient to bring it back into line. So the AIP falls into the first category, removing triggers, and more specifically, it would fall into the category of removing dietary triggers. So if for a particular patient, the primary trigger for them was dietary in origin, it was things that they were eating that was provoking an inflammatory response and really wreaking havoc on the immune system, then removing that trigger for that person could settle their inflammation and lead to long-lasting healing. And that healing could itself lead to being able to tolerate that same dietary trigger, or those same dietary triggers that originally caused the problem. So, if you think of it like if you have an injury, for example, or let's say you were playing soccer and you got injured, while you're injured, playing soccer is probably going to be painful and difficult and possibly even make the injury worse. But there's no reason that once you heal the injury, you can't go back to playing soccer. So that's kind of a similar idea here. If food triggers were originally provoked a response, in some cases, but not all, I'll come back to that, removing the trigger may allow the body to heal sufficiently such that you can actually even return to eating that food trigger that initially caused the problem without any difficulty. However, there are a lot of exceptions and caveats to what I just said. So probably the biggest one is gluten. In many cases, no matter how much healing happens, a patient who's significantly gluten intolerant will never recover the ability to eat gluten without problems. Now, there are always exceptions to the rule, and I've actually seen that happen in some cases, but at least in my experience, it is the exception and not the rule. There are also some other dietary antigens like eggs and dairy that seem to have more of a persistent effect over time, even after gut healing takes place. So less so in kids. I think kids can tend to outgrow these things and move on from them more so than adults. But with adults, I don't see as many people fully recovering their ability to tolerate eggs and dairy if they haven't been able to tolerate them at all. Although there's some shades of gray there. For example, if somebody is lactose intolerant rather than intolerant to the proteins in dairy, there are some studies that suggest that consuming fermented dairy can actually restore lactose tolerance. And I've seen that with some patients. So, I'm qualifying everything I say, which can be irritating, but that's really how it is in clinical practice and working with patients. And if, everybody's different and everybody responds in a different way. And so it's really hard to make general statements about this stuff without providing those qualifications. Okay, so let's get back to this framework we're looking at here, where we're talking about step 1 of removing triggers, and we're talking about dietary triggers, and that in some cases, removing these dietary triggers can be enough to heal and even lead to being able to eat some of those same foods that were removed in order to heal in the first place. So that may happen in some cases. But in many cases, I've found that diet, although it's really important, isn't enough on its own to resolve the problem. And we have to start looking at other things that could trigger and exacerbate an immune response. And these include gut issues like SIBO, dysbiosis, intestinal permeability, disrupted gut microbiome, stress, which I think is absolutely huge with autoimmune disease. I think it's the elephant in the room that's often not addressed, despite the fact that there are many, many studies showing that stress is a common trigger across every single autoimmune disease that we know about. And I've just seen that be such a huge factor in all of my patients with autoimmune disease. Sleep, physical activity, not enough or too much, lack of social support. I think another really key factor in autoimmune disease, the role of environmental toxins like heavy metals, mold, etc., infections like latent viral infections or tick-borne illnesses like Lyme or Babesia Bartonella, intracellular infections, methylation issues, mitochondrial issues, etc. So all of these things can trigger or exacerbate immune dysfunction. And some of these things can be explored and regulated without any testing, such as the sleep and stress management, physical activity, social support. But others will require some testing, particularly the gut issues, screening for environmental toxins, infections, methylation, and mitochondrial issues. And so, as you can gather, there's quite a bit of work that goes into this. And in some cases, it will probably need to be done with someone, a functional medicine specialist who knows how to do this kind of testing. And it can take months or even longer. This is why our conventional medical model, which is really geared towards single patient, single disease, single treatment, and you're done, that doesn't really work that well in this world of complex chronic illness that we live in. So, this exploration will often take some time. It often requires some testing. And in some cases, if you just remove all of the triggers and you address all of these things that can exacerbate immune dysfunction, that will be enough to restore normal immune function. But in other cases, you have to go on to step 2, which is taking specific actions to regulate and balance the immune system. So this includes relatively simple things like optimizing vitamin D levels, optimizing glutathione status, optimizing short-chain fatty acid production, particularly butyrate, which has an immunoregulatory, anti-inflammatory role, considering more advanced nutritional interventions like therapeutic fasting, which has been shown to have an immunoregulatory effect in some really interesting recent studies by Dr. Walter Longo out of USC, using botanicals or nutraceuticals that play an immunoregulatory role, and then even low doses of medication like naltrexone, low-dose naltrexone, which I've spoken about before for immune tolerance and regulation. And these things can play a really vital role in helping to get the immune system back into that range of tolerance from where it's easier to maintain itself in that range. So what I can tell you is that when a more comprehensive 2-step approach is used like that, removing the triggers and then taking specific actions to regulate the immune system, many people are eventually able to reintroduce foods successfully in their diet. But that said, some sensitivities, some foods often persist. So let's take someone who is on AIP and they have to be very strict. The most typical response that I see is after a comprehensive functional medicine protocol, where we explore all of these triggers and we do things to regulate the immune system, maybe they're able to start eating some dairy products and nightshades, but eggs just continue to be off the table. Or maybe they're able to tolerate eggs and nightshades, but they just never recover their ability to eat dairy. Or let's take someone who's been on a low FODMAP diet to prevent recurrence of SIBO. Once we address the SIBO, and then perhaps we find that they've got an underlying mercury toxicity that is probably was causing their SIBO to recur over and over again, and we address the mercury toxicity, and their SIBO kind of resolves once and for all. Let's say that person might typically be able to start eating FODMAPs in fruits. Maybe they're fine with the higher fructose. Maybe they're fine with sugar alcohols. Maybe they're fine with most classes of FODMAPs, but they just never really recover an ability to eat a lot of onions and garlic, particularly raw onions. Those just still trigger them despite feeling better in every other way and having addressed all the issues that have been identified. That's just the lingering effect for that person. So that is probably the most typical response. And, if we take a step back and think about this a little bit further, it leads us to an interesting question, which is, what is the goal of treatment? What is health? What are we actually hoping to achieve? In some cases, I see patients who quite understandably, have a memory of what it was like to feel really, really good the last time that they felt just perfect and had no complaints. And maybe this was in their early 20s or something like that. And they really have it in their minds that they want to get back to that particular feeling. And now they're 35 or 40. And, the reality is, in many cases, it may not be possible to return to that exact feeling that somebody had 15 years ago or 20 years ago, the last time they remember feeling perfectly well, because the body changes over time. And there are some changes that we have considerable control over, and there are some changes that we have less control over, particularly if there was an infection or an accident or something that had a profound impact on the body. We know that many autoimmune diseases are triggered by viral infections or other infections, for example. And once that process of autoimmunity gets going, it can be managed very effectively without drugs, with diet and changes in this whole process that we're talking about. But in many, if not most cases, that doesn't mean that the condition will be completely cured. That person may always produce some antibodies to whatever tissue that they started producing them to. And if we remove the triggers and take specific steps to regulate the immune system, that person may be able to live symptom-free or mostly symptom-free, but they may never, return to that feeling that they had prior to the infection and the autoimmune disease. They may never be able to eat some of the foods that they were able to eat prior to that infection and autoimmune disease. And they may reach a new level, a new place of balance and equilibrium and homeostasis that's possible for their given circumstances and state of their body at that particular point in time, rather than going back to some idea of or memory of the way things were, 15 or 20 years ago. So for me, this is a really interesting question. I've talked about it. I've written about it before and talked about it before. Of what is health really? How do we define it? Do we define it as the absence of symptoms? That can be problematic as a definition, of course, because the absence of symptoms when and what circumstances? Is there an absence of symptoms when we eat whatever we want? Or does it mean an absence of symptoms when we eat a specific diet? Or does it mean an absence of symptoms when we mostly follow a specific diet, but sometimes go off the reservation a little bit, somewhere in between? It gets tricky, right? If you use the absence of symptoms as a definition. I've long argued for a more inclusive definition of health that comes from Moshe Feldenkrais, who is the creator of the Feldenkrais method, if you might be familiar with. It's a pretty amazing method of reprogramming the nervous system, body-based intervention. And his definition of health is the ability to live your dreams. Now, I find that to be, at the very least, provocative and a great topic for discussion, because it doesn't refer to anything at all in terms of symptoms or energy levels or pain or anything like that. A lot of the things that most people would use to define health, it simply refers to the ability to live your dreams. And when you think about it that way, someone that has, perfect physical health, if that exists, it's hard to even quantify what that would be, but if we think about it as a spectrum, where on the left is, perfect health, and on the right is death, it's maybe they're closer to the perfect health side. But let's say that person is miserable, they have, terrible relationships, they are working a job that they hate, and they're just really unhappy in their life. Is that person healthy? Versus perhaps somebody who has an autoimmune disease, maybe they have Hashimoto's or rheumatoid arthritis, and maybe they are on a fairly restricted diet, but they take really good care of themselves. They have really positive relationships. They are doing work that's meaningful to them. Perhaps they're helping other people with similar condition to recover. They wake up feeling excited and happy to face the day. And sure, maybe there are times during the day where they don't feel like they have quite as much energy as they would like to have, or they have some, pain that flares up occasionally, especially if they're exposed to foods they don't typically eat. But overall, they're living a meaningful, rewarding, and fulfilling life. Who is healthy? Is that first person with that perfect physical health, but everything else falling apart, healthy? Or is that second person who has some physical challenges but still really living their dreams, healthy? I think you know what my answer would be, but I encourage you to think of your own answer, because the answer to the question, what is health, really provides an important context and framework through which we interpret our experience. And I think that is really, really important, and something that's often overlooked for anybody that's dealing with chronic illness. How we hold ourselves in that place when we have chronic illness, whether we see ourselves as somebody that is fundamentally healthy but dealing with some physical challenges, or whether we see ourselves as someone that is broken and sick and ill and is a person that has a chronic disease, can really make all the difference in the world in terms of how we relate to ourselves and the world around us. And I think it's a very, very important thing to consider and look at for anybody that's dealing with ongoing symptoms. Okay, so in summary here, I think elimination diets are often an important part of the treatment, but they're often not the only important thing to look at. In my practice with patients, we go beyond and look at that two-step framework of removing triggers that provoke or exacerbate an immune response, and then taking specific steps to regulate the immune system if necessary after that. The only other thing I want to mention before we finish is that I am definitely wary of too much dietary restriction for too long, and there are a few reasons for that. One big one is concerns about nutrient deficiency. As I mentioned in the beginning of the show, I advocate eating the broadest diet within the paleo type of template as possible, because that will expose us to the widest range of nutrients, and that's very important, of course, for health. But there are also other issues that can happen with a diet that's really super restricted, like social isolation, not having enough fun or play, not being able to go out and enjoy dinner or meals with friends. And as I mentioned earlier, that kind of stress and social isolation, I think, is a major factor in autoimmune disease, and also just with chronic disease in general. And I have many, many stories of patients with whom I've gone through the entire process, the functional medicine process, doing all the labs, doing the diet restriction, identifying and addressing triggers, regulating the immune system. And ultimately, the thing that made the biggest difference for those patients was not any of what I just described, but actually turning their attention to their social environment, actually loosening some of the restriction on their diet, making sure they're spending more time with friends and getting support that they need, making sure they have more fun and pleasure in their lives, getting regular massage, taking a hot bath, walking on the beach, spending time in nature, developing some deeper friendships with people where they can share what's going on in their life. A lot of times these things they're less tangible, they can seem less important. We all kind of pay them lip service and tend to think that more tangible things like taking supplements or medications or making dietary changes will have a bigger impact. But the reality is, when you look at the research, a lot of these less tangible things actually can have a greater impact on quality of life and even symptoms in people who are dealing with autoimmune disease. And I've definitely found that to be true in my work with patients, and this is a growing focus. So I hope that was helpful, Michaela. Lots of information there, but I hope you can make sense of that and it helps you and others who are listening in some way. And please do keep sending in your question, kriskresser.com/podcast question. Even though I'm not able to answer all of them, they help me understand what you're thinking and what you want to know about, and they inform my ideas for blog posts in addition to podcasts and other content that we're developing. So please do keep sending in your questions, and enjoy your weekend, and I'll talk to you soon. Take care. That's the end of this episode of Revolution Health Radio. If you appreciate the show and want to help me create a healthier and happier world, please head over to iTunes and leave us a review. They really do make a difference. If you'd like to ask a question for me to answer on a future episode, you can do that at kriskresser.com/podcast question. You can also leave a suggestion for someone you'd like me to interview there. If you're on social media, you can follow me at twitter.com/Chris Kresser or facebook.com/Chris Kresser LAC. I post a lot of articles and research that I do throughout the week there that never makes it to the blog or podcast, so it's a great way to stay abreast of the latest developments. Thanks so much for listening. Talk to you next time.